and welcome. I'm Leigh-Ann Gerrans and you're watching W News, broadcasting live from the Al Arabiya headquarters. These are our top stories. Hamas agreed to a Gaza ceasefire in a proposal by US Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, according to Reuters news agency, but Witkoff denies the claims. Trump accuses Putin of going absolutely crazy as Russia fires hundreds of drones and missiles at Ukraine. French President Emmanuel Macron is struck by wife Brigitte as he touches down in Vietnam for a tour of Southeast Asia. And King Charles is on his way to Canada ahead of opening the country's parliament on Tuesday. To our top story, and reports are circulating that Hamas have agreed to a Gaza ceasefire in a proposal by US Special Envoy Steve Witkoff. That's according to Reuters news agency, who were told by a Palestinian official on Monday. The new deal would reportedly see the release of 10 hostages and 7 days of truce. However, Steve Witkoff has denied these claims, according to Axios, and says the group's stance is disappointing and unacceptable. Let's speak to Middle East correspondent and author Yotam Confino. Yotam, thanks so much for joining me. So, according to various reports, Hamas has agreed to a US proposal on a ceasefire in Gaza. But what is the full story?
I think, as usual, we have to take these reports with a grain of salt, because Hamas would like the world to know that it's flexible, that it wants a ceasefire. But as Steve Witkoff also said, they did not agree to his proposal. What Hamas is doing is essentially saying, we would like a temporary ceasefire, and it could be Steve Witkoff's proposal, but we would like a guarantee that this will lead to a permanent ceasefire where Hamas stays not necessarily in power, but that Hamas is still active inside Gaza. Now, this is not the offer that's on the table, and this is why Steve Witkoff said that their response was unacceptable. And also Israel has said that they're not going to agree to what Hamas is suggesting here. Israel has agreed to Steve Witkoff's proposal, which would see a 45-day ceasefire and the release of 10 living hostages.
And Yotam, can you bring us up to date with the recent Israeli airstrikes? And is this halting aid from entering the Strip?
So Israel has struck more than 200 Hamas targets all over Gaza in the past 48 hours, including what we heard this morning, a former school where people were sheltering, where Israel also said that Hamas was hiding. So Israel is really ramping up attacks all across Gaza. They also issued evacuation orders for the city of Khan Yunis again, and they're telling people to seek to the coast, to the safe zone, as they call it, al-Mawazi. But as you just mentioned, whenever Israel carries out strikes here, does it impact this distribution of aid? Absolutely, especially in northern Gaza. All the aid that's coming in now, which is roughly on average 100 trucks per day, most of that aid is being distributed in southern Gaza. It doesn't really reach northern Gaza because that's where Israel is really going hard against Hamas. So yes, Israel's aggressive airstrikes and military offensive is definitely impacting the distribution of aid.
And Israeli forces have announced plans to take over 75% of Gaza and divide Gaza into 3 zones for civilians. Can you tell us more about these plans?
Yes, so the IDF announced that currently they are holding 40% of Gaza. They're in control of 40%, but they would like to up it to 75%, and that can be done once they launch a major ground offensive, and that would take about 2 months. That's according to the Israeli estimate. Now, it's quite interesting to see that it's not all of Gaza that the IDF is trying to control, because that's what Prime Minister Netanyahu said, that he wants Israel to control all of Gaza. But nevertheless, this is the plan. And then they're going to just basically divide all of the Palestinians into 3 zones, one in the south, one in the center, and one in the north. So 3 zones where these 2.2 million people are going to be sheltering until Israel gets rid of all of Hamas's military infrastructure. So the focus is now going to shift from constantly going after members of Hamas and killing them, to taking control and making sure that Hamas does not come back and fill the vacuum after the Israeli soldiers leave those territories.
And Yotam, there have been reports of scuffles and insults as Israelis celebrate Jerusalem Day under the shadow of the Gaza war, which we've just been discussing. What more do we know?
Look, it's been a horrible day. Let's put it like this. Every year, we see thousands of mainly young religious Jews entering Jerusalem to celebrate that Israel captured Jerusalem in the 1967 war. But more often than not, we see a lot of them simply taking advantage of the situation by going around and threatening and harassing local Arab shop owners. They spit on them. They chant these racist chants such as your village is going to burn and death to Arabs. And they feel empowered and emboldened because the police are protecting them through the Muslim quarters, through the Christian quarters, if they enter there, and also through the Jewish quarter, of course. And they feel like they have the backing of the government because the national security minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir, who belongs to this far-right segment of Israeli society, he's with them. He just came now, and he's basically marching with them. So this is very threatening to the local, especially local Palestinian residents of East Jerusalem, but it's also being criticized harshly inside Israel, mainly by opposition lawmakers who say that this does not represent Zionism or Judaism.
Yotam Confino, Middle East correspondent and author. Always great to have you on the show. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Let's get into this further with Adnan Abu Hasna, media advisor and UNRWA spokesperson. Adnan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
UNRWA says Gaza needs 500 to 600 aid trucks daily to avert further disaster. Is the volume of supplies entering Gaza currently helping to avoid a humanitarian crisis? We just heard from our correspondent earlier about 100 trucks are currently entering Gaza now.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. What is really entering Gaza, right now, maybe we can talk about 150 trucks only because, now the bakeries inside Gaza, which had been open in the last 2 days, today they are closed, especially in the south and in the middle area. Nothing had gone actually to the north, but the bakery is closed and no bread at all now being handed to the Palestinian in these areas. There's so many obstacles in the way of getting in the trucks, that loss of wheat flour and other supplies.
UNRWA's West Bank coordinator has said Israeli protesters have broken into a Palestinian refugee compound. Is the situation now under control, and how safe are the refugees?
It's the compound in Sheikh Jarrah area. Actually, it's closed. We are not there, anymore after, Israeli instructions and after the Knesset bills that, actually the police and the municipality of Jerusalem, they closed that place. And we don't have either, international staff or local staff in Jerusalem. And we are, a little bit, surprised. What they are doing, actually, you close it. There's nothing there. But they're trying to make, like the show off, to see that they are storming UNRWA headquarters again and again. But the place is closed, no electricity, no water, no stuff, nothing there.
As Israel continues its renewed war on Hamas, strikes have targeted a school turned into a shelter in Gaza City, killing dozens of people. Are families and children able to protect themselves and find safety amid the ongoing strikes?
Of course, no one. There is no safe place actually in Gaza. Now, what Israel is doing now that they are pushing the whole population of Gaza, more than 2 million people now in less than 100 square kilometers. Actually, if you throw stone, you will kill and injure, people. Not only to use F-16 and tanks and navy and all kinds of munition. No, I believe that what's going now, in Gaza, 50% of the Gaza population, they are children, more than 50%. Because of that, the number of children that had been killed in the last, several weeks are very high, because you cannot exclude that from what's going on actually, and it's really horrible. Every day, people are dying while they are hungry, and this is unbelievable. It is the darkest days since October 7th right now.
And you have thousands of staff members currently in Gaza. What are you hearing from them? What are they reporting back to you? You said there's a number of children who have been injured. People are going hungry. What else are they telling you about the situation?
Telling us that there are, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. They are starving, actually. People they have nothing to eat. Sometimes, the entire family eat, maybe some breads for every 2 or 3 breads every 48 hours or 72 hours. It's unbelievable. There is no drinkable water at all, and because of that, the number of sick people are rising and rising. You cannot imagine that we actually treated in 4 days or 5 days nearly 100,000 Palestinians in Gaza. It never happened before. We are talking about a place that 90% of Gaza infrastructure, desalination, everything, houses, shelters had been completely destroyed. You know what they are doing now? They are destroying what had been destroyed, before. And now the people are they have no umbrella, they have no protection at all, and they are exposed to death, to hunger, to being thirsty all the time.
Adnan Abu Hasna, media advisor and UNRWA spokesperson. It was great to have you on the show. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me. Bye.
Let's take a look at some of the other stories making the headlines today. President Trump has appeared alongside his Vice President J.D. Vance and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth to commemorate Memorial Day today. The three participated in the traditional wreath-laying ceremony at Arlington Cemetery. The U.S. president later paid tribute to soldiers killed in service. Authorities in India's southern Kerala state have issued an alert after an MSC ship carrying oil and hazardous cargo leaked and sank off the coast. The spill occurred in a Liberian-flagged vessel that capsized on Sunday. All 24 crew members on board the ship have been rescued, but some of the ship's 640 containers have reportedly been drifting towards the shore. North Korea has arrested a fourth official following last week's failed launch of a new Navy warship. The country's leader, Kim Jong-un, called the incident a criminal act caused by absolute carelessness. The deputy director of the ruling Workers' Party's Munitions Industry Department is the most senior official to be detained for the incident. And 2 humanoid robots traded punches while fans watched on in a competition held in China on Sunday. The event marked a world's first combat sport event featuring humanoid robots. The robots were remotely controlled by human engineers with pre-programmed boxing moves. Now, US President Donald Trump has threatened Russia with more sanctions after Moscow launched its biggest drone attack on Ukraine since the start of the war over the weekend. Speaking to reporters, the US president called out the Russian President Vladimir Putin before telling his Truth Social followers Putin had gone absolutely crazy. Take a listen.
Yeah, I'll give you an update. I'm not happy with what Putin's doing. He's killing a lot of people, and I don't know what the hell happened to Putin. I've known him a long time, always gotten along with him, but he's sending rockets into cities and killing people, and I don't like it at all, okay? We're in the middle of talking, and he's shooting rockets into Kyiv and other cities. I don't like it at all.
Mr. President, what do you want to do about that?
I'm surprised. I'm very surprised. We'll see what we're going to do. Killing people. And something happened to this guy, and I don't like it.
We can now speak to Ben Aris, founder and editor-in-chief of BNE in WNews and former Moscow bureau chief of the Daily Telegraph. Absolute pleasure to have you on the show, Ben. So we just heard from Donald Trump there. It was a fairly stern comments when he came to the condemnation of Putin, saying he's gone absolutely crazy. Is this clear frustration from the US president playing out here?
He's frustrated. He's impatient. If you remember going into the elections, he was saying that he was going to end the war in Ukraine within 24 hours. Then that transmorphed into the first 100 days. The first 100 days are now past. And the ceasefire talks, which did kick off in Riyadh in the middle of February, have basically stalled. That both sides are digging in their heels. The issue turns on this 30-day unconditional ceasefire that Trump proposed in March. And Zelensky immediately accepted that. And Putin said in principle he would accept it, but had a whole bunch of conditions. And those conditions are still being negotiated. The foreign minister is supposed to produce a new list this week, laying out the exact terms whereby Russia would be prepared to go into talks, but it's not going anywhere. And Trump, this is frustrating. I mean, he wanted a PR win. He wants to look like the great peacemaker. He wants to bring this war to an end. And of course, this weekend, we had this massive barrage, this onslaught targeting Kyiv, which is normally not targeted. And moreover, in overwhelming numbers, 300 drones, over 100 cruise missiles, the most that's been used since the start of the war, hitting residential areas, and not just in Kyiv, but cities right the way across Ukraine, including cities in the West, which haven't really been touched much for the last year. And Trump is like, where's my ceasefire? Where's my deal? Where's my PR win? It's not happening. And so he's getting fed up. Having said that, it remains to be seen the states have been threatening bone-crushing sanctions. And Trump is a lot of talk, but we've seen from him, as far as the Russians are concerned, very little action so far.
And Ben, you spent many years in Russia, and the Kremlin is accusing the US president of emotional overload. Do you agree with this assessment? And is Russia's trademark flattery of Donald Trump that we've seen in the last few months slowly vanishing?
I think it's better to understand it that Trump's caught in a dilemma. On the one hand, he wants to be seen as a peacemaker. He casts himself as a deal maker, and he would like to bring this war to an end. On the other hand, he's a businessman. I mean, he's turned the whole US foreign policy into a purely transactional business with his tariffs and the negotiations going on there. And he's sort of caught on the horns here between wanting to bring the war to an end, but he's not particularly interested in geopolitics and doing business. He's made it very clear that he sees Russia's oil, gas, rare earth minerals, critical minerals, commodities, and he wants to do business. And so he's not prepared to give that up because at the end of the day, he is a businessman. And now he's caught in a dilemma whereby if he sanctions Russia, then he has to walk away from all those billion-dollar deals that he's been looking at. And I think he's unhappy about it, which is why I'm saying I'm reserving judgment to see what happens, because the EU, they're talking about, unbearable sanctions need to be brought onto Russia in order to break its back and force Putin to the negotiating table. But that doesn't work without the US help. If Trump's not on board with those unbearable sanctions, then they won't make any difference. And Trump has actually offered to lift sanctions as part of the negotiations, something the EU wasn't happy about at all.
Okay, so Ben, sanctions might not work in this case. Trump has said he wanted to achieve peace through strength. Is this method working when it comes to negotiations with Russia? Or is it time to start applying maximum pressure? If sanctions aren't going to be the answer, what is?
Indeed, I think we've reached that point because the Russians have been participating in the talks starting in Riyadh, going through to the Istanbul deal. meeting that was just 2 weeks ago, the first time the direct contact between Ukraine side and Russian side since the war began. And it's stalled, and people have been complaining and saying that Putin's playing for time. And I think the size and ferocity of this missile attack this weekend now definitively says that the Kremlin's actually not interested in talks. It thinks it's got the advantage on the battlefield, which it actually does. And Putin wants to see it through the fighting season. We're just coming into the main fighting season in the summer, which will go through until September when the mud comes back. And Putin wants to make as much gains as he can. And he's only prepared to do talks if Zelensky basically capitulates, gives up the 5 regions that Russia occupies, promises never to join NATO. And so sanctions in this play a role. But the trouble with sanctions, I mean, we've had like 17 rounds from the EU, and they basically had no effect. So Russia, over the last 2 years, has been the strongest growing major economy in the world, while the EU itself, the bounce back effect from those sanctions, has put most of Europe into recession. And it is possible to make these sanctions effectively. You can, in theory, cut Russia's oil exports off completely. But if you do that, the pain to the rest of the world, particularly the States and Western Europe, would be enormous. And I don't think anybody's willing to swallow that pain. So you're left in this sort of gray zone between them. And while Europe, I think, is willing to go the whole hog and do the extreme sanctions, the Americans certainly aren't. And Trump has, as I said, he's a lot of talk so far, but they do have some extremely painful sanctions up their sleeve. This 500% tariffs on anyone that buys Russian oil, which would be new, which would mean attacking India and China. But that hasn't happened yet, and I remain skeptical that it will happen.
And Ben, briefly, Germany has green-lighted the use of NATO missile strikes deep into Russia as Macron demands Trump to take action against Putin. Is Europe actually doing enough right now?
Well, Europe's ability to do anything is limited. I mean, again, after several years, 5 years of poly-crisis, pandemic, etc., its money stocks are depleted. Everybody's struggling on that front. And after supporting Ukraine for 3 years, they've also run down their military stocks. And the EU is in the process of trying to rearm. They're talking about spending $800 billion on rearming, because now they can no longer rely on American military support. That Trump snapped the security umbrella closed. But this thing with the missiles, that's new. That came out this afternoon from Merz, the German chancellor, and he's lifted, and the EU team have lifted all restrictions on weapons. And what that means in practice is that they're talking about sending the most powerful long-range missiles, particularly the German Tariffs missile and the French-British Storm Shadow missiles. And these things can hit deep into Russian territory. I mean, you're talking about being able to take factories out, logistics hubs out, hundreds of kilometers inside Russia, which would be militarily a big blow to Russia. But it does raise the specter then that the Russians will turn around and say, actually, this is not Ukraine attacking us, this is NATO, and then responding with an attack on NATO. So it is, I mean, we've gone up a notch towards possible Third World War in terms of escalation, depending on what they send and how it's used.
Ben Aris, founder and editor-in-chief of WNews. It was brilliant to have your insights. I appreciate your time. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Now, French President Emmanuel Macron has arrived in Vietnam for a tour of Southeast Asia. However, it was this footage of Macron appearing to be struck by his wife Brigitte as the couple prepared to leave the aircraft at Hanoi Airport, which has been making all the headlines today. The Élysée Palace initially denied the legitimacy of the clip after it went viral overnight, but French media have now confirmed it is actually real. We can get the latest from our correspondent in Paris, Ross Cullen. So, Ross Cullen, a bizarre video showing Macron being pushed in the face by his wife, as I mentioned, has gone viral. What more do we know?
Yeah, that's right, Leigh-Ann. Extraordinary scenes when the plane touched down on Sunday in the airport in Hanoi on the tarmac. The door opens and the cameras were rolling and they could see inside Brigitte Macron appearing to have her two hands up against Emmanuel Macron's cheeks, potentially trying to slap her husband. And then Emmanuel Macron realised the door was open and the cameras were rolling, waved to the crowds, and then appeared to storm off into the cabin. Then they later came out to go down the steps. Emmanuel Macron put his arm out, the crook of his elbow, perhaps for his wife to take hold, but she didn't look at her husband and instead just walked down holding the banister. Now, the Élysée Palace have said that this was a moment of intimacy, trying to downplay the incident, saying there are bigger things to focus on, but the French president has also reacted. We can listen in now to a little bit more of what Emmanuel Macron has had to say.
Si vous faites l'agenda international du président de la République française, de Kiev à Tirana jusqu'à Hanoï, il y a des gens qui ont regardé des vidéos et qui pensent que j'ai partagé un sac de cocaïne, que j'ai fait un mano à mano avec un président turc et que là maintenant je suis en train d'avoir une scène de ménage avec ma femme. Rien de tout ça n'est vrai, pourtant ces trois vidéos sont vraies. Donc il faut que tout le monde se calme et surtout s'intéresse.
There we go. So a little bit more from Emmanuel Macron there. And if I'm right, he says that they were just joking and horsing around. But Ross, the president is in Vietnam, and is this controversy overshadowing his visit there?
Well, it's certainly been what a lot of people have been talking about, so much so that the French president has had to react. The Élysée Palace have had to react, but he is there in Vietnam to try to portray France as a reliable and stable trading partner, particularly in the context of the volatility on world stock markets and the instabilities and uncertainties running through the global trading system that have been provoked by the Trump administration's imposition of tariffs since the start of April. France also wanting to remind partners in Southeast Asia that it can be a regional counterweight to the growing influence of China in the region. France also sees itself as an Indo-Pacific power in its own right.
And Ross, European stocks are actually rising today after Trump says he will delay 50% tariffs on the EU until the 9th of July. How has this been received by the bloc ahead of talks?
Yeah, that's right. So the CAC 40 stock market here in France was up. The DAX in Europe's biggest economy, Germany, also ending the day in the black. So there are some positive signs on European stock markets because they were all feeling pretty negative on Friday when the president announced the next round of tariffs that were likely to be imposed on the European Union, and then just 48 hours later rode back and said there could be a pause now until early in July, giving time for talks, giving space for dialogue. We had a call on Sunday between the US president and the president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen. Both leaders saying that that telephone exchange was good, was positive, that there is space for talks, that they do want to do a deal, that there's no rush. They have time now for both sides to try to understand they can come to an agreement, because the European investors first of all had to react in April to the imposition of tariffs, then the postponement of tariffs, then the new imposition of tariffs on Friday, then the second delay to these tariffs. It certainly is the instability, what a lot of people in Europe are seeing as the erratic nature of making international trading decisions that can be putting some investors off track. But hopefully for now, with this agreement to continue talks between Donald Trump and Ursula von der Leyen, there can be perhaps a more settled future for Washington-Brussels trade relations. Leigh-Ann?
Ross Cullen in Paris, thank you so much for joining us. Education authorities in Hong Kong have called on the city's universities to open their doors to people affected by US President Donald Trump's attempt to ban Harvard from enrolling international students. Under the move, foreign students who currently study there would be forced to transfer to other schools or lose their legal status. Patrick Falk has the latest from Hong Kong.
Well, Harvard has launched legal action against the Trump administration's move to block it from accepting international students, but that's done little to assuage concern among those that might be affected. Reports say close to 7,000 international students are at risk. 1/5 of Harvard's international intake in the last academic year were Chinese nationals, and Hong Kong, which is still regarded by many people as the most international city in Chinese territory, appears to be taking full advantage, if you want to put it that way. The city's Education Bureau is calling on universities here to safeguard legitimate rights of international students. It's also calling on universities to use this as an opportunity to attract top talent. In addition, it's reached out directly to the Harvard Club of Hong Kong to offer support to students that have been admitted for the coming academic year to Harvard. And some of Hong Kong's universities are implementing their own measures as well. Hong Kong's University of Science and Technology, in particular, is offering unconditional offers to displaced Harvard students. Hong Kong Polytechnic University also offering full acceptance to those admitted to Harvard. Now, Hong Kong is home to 5 of the world's top 100 universities. That's according to the Times Higher Education World University Rankings. But in recent years, it's had to integrate national security as well as patriotic education into its system. And that's raised some concern about academic freedom. Trump's move comes, as we know, as the US and China are locked in a battle for influence globally. And some observers say that America is still an aspiration for a lot of people in Asia and a lot of people in China, certainly, where a lot of people would still want to work and study, and that this move could have lasting damage to Washington's ability to harness its soft power. Hong Kong is poised to capitalize. Patrick Falk, Al Arabiya, Hong Kong.
Now, King Charles will begin his tour of Canada tomorrow, his first as the country's head of state. The British monarch and Queen Camilla will meet the country's newly elected Prime Minister Mark Carney when they arrive in Ottawa later. The King will open Canada's Parliament on Tuesday, a task also undertaken by Queen Elizabeth in 1957. We can now speak to royal correspondent Sarah Hewson. Sarah, thank you so much for joining us. Buckingham Palace has described this trip as impactful. This comes amid delicate relations between America and Canada. What are the main hopes and objectives for this visit?
Well, hello to you, Leigh-Ann. This is a very short trip, just over 24 hours, but it is certainly going to pack a punch in terms of its significance and its symbolism as we see King Charles, the King of Canada, jetting into the country just as it is trying to fend off advances from the quasi-King of America, Donald Trump. Now, the King is going to have to employ all of those years of experience as a global statesman to walk the diplomatic tightrope, because he is being employed by Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, to try and ensure closer ties between Britain and the United States. At the same time as the new Canadian Prime Minister, Mark Carney, is calling on the King to bolster Canada's sovereignty and its resistance of Donald Trump's calls for Canada to become the 51st state. And Canada wasn't too happy to see the King's letter inviting Donald Trump for an unprecedented second state visit to Britain being brandished in the Oval Office. So this visit will go some way to reassuring Canadians that the King has their back and supports their right to sovereignty.
And as you mentioned, King Charles will open Canada's Parliament tomorrow, a task, of course, once undertaken by his mother, the late Queen Elizabeth. How significant, Sarah, will this be?
Well, it's really significant. The King walking in his late mother's footsteps. It is only the second time that a monarch has opened Canada's Parliament, the late Queen doing so in 1957. And he'll also be making the speech from the throne, the speech that sets out the new government's legislative agenda for the coming term. And that's only the third time that a monarch has done so. Queen Elizabeth did it in 1957 during that visit, and also in 1977 she visited as part of her Silver Jubilee celebrations. So an unusual act, a significant act for the King, and also every word that he utters will be pored over, given the sensitivity of this visit, given the stakes being so high for Canada amid those advances from President Trump.
And what else is on the agenda whilst the King and Queen are visiting Canada?
Well, obviously, the state opening of Parliament is the main event, and it's going to be somewhat less pomp and ceremony than we would see in the United Kingdom. There's going to be no robes and crowns, but still a big ceremonial event. They'll be travelling to the Senate in a state carriage. There will be a military guard of honour. There'll be a 21-gun salute. But before that, on arrival, they're due in the next 30 minutes, Leigh-Ann, but on arrival, there'll be a ceremonial welcome at the airport in Ottawa, and then they'll be visiting a local community event to learn about Canadian heritage. The King will be meeting Indigenous leaders, and he'll also be dropping the puck in a street hockey game. There'll be a bilateral meeting with Prime Minister Carney, also with the Governor-General as well. And then tomorrow, after the state opening of Parliament and after that speech to the throne, they are heading back to Britain.
And how do Canadians view the monarchy?
Really good question, Leigh-Ann, and it's a shifting narrative because the King has never been able to achieve the same level of popularity as his late mother, Queen Elizabeth II. But over the course of the last year, we have seen more and more favour towards King Charles, and Canadians starting to warm to him as monarch. And I think, in fact, President Trump's interventions have actually played in the King's favour, because Canadians are starting to see their ties to the monarchy and the Commonwealth as setting them apart from their neighbours to the south and bolstering them as a nation. And so I think King Charles will receive a warm welcome. Not everyone will be warm, particularly those in the province in Quebec who are ardently against having a British monarch as their head of state and want a Canadian head of state. But I think overall, the anticipation is that he will be welcomed and that his visit coming at this particularly critical time will be appreciated by the Canadian people.
Royal correspondent Sarah Hewson, brilliant to have you on. Thank you for all your insights. Let's take a look at the top business news now. US steel will stay under American control even following a deal with Nippon Steel. That was Donald Trump's claim to reporters on Sunday as part of a merger announced last week. The Japanese company will invest $14 billion in the firm. Shares in China-listed Apple suppliers have fallen after Trump's tariff threat on imported iPhones. Shares in Luxshare, which assembles iPhones and makes AirPods, fell 2.2%, while Chinese mobile screen maker LensTech slipped 1.8%. On Friday, Trump said he may slap a 25% tariff on any iPhone sold but not made in the US. Turning to all the sports news now, and Arsenal women celebrated winning the Champions League with a trophy lift at the Emirates Stadium in North London earlier today. They were crowned the champions of Europe on Saturday with a 1-0 win over Barcelona. Crystal Palace and Liverpool are also holding parades today to celebrate their recent successes in the FA Cup and also the Premier League. And finally, the big four from the world of tennis have reunited at Rafa Nadal's French Open farewell. Roger Federer, Novak Djokovic and Andy Murray were all on court to give an emotional farewell to the 14-time champion. Reigning French Open champions Carlos Alcaraz and Iga Swiatek were among the 15,000 crowd watching that truly amazing ceremony at Roland Garros. A reminder of our top stories. Hamas agreed to a Gaza ceasefire in a proposal by US Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, according to Reuters news agency, but Witkoff denies the claims. Trump accuses Putin of going absolutely crazy as Russia fires hundreds of drones and missiles at Ukraine. French President Emmanuel Macron is struck by his wife, Brigitte, as he touches down in Vietnam for a tour of Southeast Asia. And King Charles is on his way to Canada ahead of the opening of the country's parliament on Tuesday. And that's all from us on W News. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and also follow us on X. Plus, of course, we'll be back in a couple of hours with W News Extra. Goodbye and have a lovely evening.